Hi everyone, I'm Sandy and welcome back to my channel. Today I have a single book review or book discussion. I don't know if I'd ever call it a review really, of one of my reads from September, beginning of October, that ended up being a 5-star read. And so I really wanted to come and talk about it in detail with everyone. I'll have a spoilery or a non-spoilery kind of section and then a spoilery kind of section, and then I'll close everything out. But I'll leave timestamps for you in the description for you if you want to skip through to the non-spoilery part or skip through the spoilery part. Okay, seriously, am I a huge fan of Westerns now after reading this book? Maybe. And the book is Lonesome Dove by Larry McMurtry. Oh my gosh. Okay, so this book was originally published in 1985. It is the first book in a 4-part series. Timeline wise of the story, I think it's actually would be third if you went in the order of the story itself, but it was published first. It also won the Pulitzer Prize in 1985. The thing with this, the back of this book says, if you read only one Western novel in your life, read Lonesome Dove. I can see why. After having read this, I definitely can see why. So Lonesome Dove is an epic Western with a wide cast of characters and a lot of parallel storylines. Each chapter, or almost every chapter, switches the narrator of the story. And a lot of times I don't like that. But in this book, it was magnificent. Larry McMurtry, at the very beginning of each chapter, you knew immediately who was talking, and that made it incredibly easier to follow. The books that don't really identify who is talking and you kind of have to figure it out are the ones that I tend to struggle with. It doesn't have different timelines in it though. It's always one kind of continuous story, just parallel tracks almost in the same timeline. And so you get this really interesting picture, this multi-dimensional picture of what's going on from a lot of different perspectives, which is fascinating. It is also an incredibly brutal book. McMurtry does a wonderful job of the depiction of the Wild Wild West and how incredibly tough it was. Tough on cowboys, tough on settlers, tough on women, and a lot of times it can be incredibly graphic and very, very brutal. It doesn't pull a lot of punches for sure, and it is one of those books that is just incredible, an incredible read. And so the first part of the book, the book is broken into 2 parts. The first part is really all about learning the characters and getting to know them. And it takes quite a bit of time in that first piece to just kind of introduce everybody, get to know the characters to start. And it can be a little bit slow. In the end, I really appreciated that beginning view of all the characters, because by the time I got to the part where a lot of things were happening, I felt like I just knew them so incredibly well, and it was like getting to know friends. It really was. I know I said that with another book fairly recently, but I did feel that way with this particular book. I actually read this book as a buddy read with Jack over at Spread Book Joy. It was our first buddy read, and this book was magnificent to do as a buddy read, especially with Jack, as we would leave messages back and forth commiserating when things happened to some of our favorite characters, when we got to difficult parts in the story. It was just really wonderful to have a buddy reader with this book. I would recommend reading it with someone because it really added to my experience, and Jack is an absolutely wonderful, wonderful person and lovely booktube channel. If you're not familiar with her, I will leave her linked in the description below for you so you can go and check her out. So absolutely wonderful. But that first section, like I said, really does take some time to get through. And there's a number of characters and a number of key characters, but the first one that I can talk about a little bit in the non-spoiler section is Jake Spoon. So Jake Spoon is a former Texas Ranger and is associated with the group that is in Lonesome Dove, used to ride with them as a Ranger. And he is kind of the catalyst for a number of things that happens. But the first thing is that he comes back to Lonesome Dove and meets with Call, who's another Texas Ranger, previous Texas Ranger, and Gus, who is also was a Texas Ranger, and starts talking about Montana and Montana being beautiful, and Montana is amazing. And that makes Call want to go to Montana and want to settle a cattle ranch in Montana. They're in Texas, so it is a long, long journey that they are getting ready for. And that first section is really all about them getting the gear, getting the cattle, getting the horses, getting the workers, the cowboys to go with them. And it's slow. It's definitely slow. But it's worth it. Again, it's worth it. This part 2 is all about them on the trail. And McMurtry, life on the trail is brutal, and it is one of those things that the descriptions in the part 2 of like the wildlife and the insects and the weather is amazing, absolutely incredible. And every time you think, oh, they're going to be doing fine now, something else big happens in this. Again, lots of different characters, lots of different story paths in here. The big ones are Call and Gus and Jake. There are a number of cowboys on the trail with them as well. There are some women that show up. One of the first ones, being women of the night, I guess, or prostitutes in the little town of Lonesome Dove. Her name is Lorena. One of the complaints I would have had about this book is women in the beginning were kind of only had one job, and that's the only way that they were depicted. Towards the end, that changes, but those first kind of depictions of women were like, okay, maybe that was true in this time period. If you were out, that would be the only women that the cowboys would have interacted with. I don't know. I'm not an expert on the Old West, so I'm not anything about the Old West, actually. So yeah, but as far as like the storytelling, the prose is excellent. It is just such a wonderful book to just sit and dig into. I did in the end kind of wanted to give it a hug, because it's like, okay, it can be a little sad in places, and I won't go into the spoilery kind of component of it, because there are some really impressive and amazing kind of discoveries you go through in the book. So if you haven't read this book, know that it is worth it. It's worth the journey. It was a 5-star read for me. It's one that Jack and I are going to continue on and read the second book in the series, because we loved this book so much. And just know it can be brutal, and it can be dark, and it can be twisted in places. And, yeah, very, very excellent read. However, highly, highly recommend it. But definitely try and read it with a buddy. Okay, so that's the end of the non-spoiler part. Spoiler part. Why do so many people die in this book? Oh my gosh. Every character that I loved in this book died. Almost across the board, to the point where when one of the characters were introduced, both Jack and I were like, Larry McMurtry, don't you kill her. Like, one of the best written women was Clara, and loved her. Absolutely thought she was an amazing character. And I was terrified that she was going to be the next one that would be dead, because Larry McMurtry killed off a lot of my favorite characters in this book. So the first one being Roscoe. So Roscoe is the deputy of July Johnson. July Johnson being the sheriff back in the town where Jake had some trouble, and he's actually hunting Jake. And then July's wife runs off. It's a whole thing, lots of drama, and Roscoe has to try and find July. And Roscoe is kind of that bumbling deputy, just kind of is, lost out there, is going at a very slow pace, and July is screaming along trying to find where Jake is at, and so has no real hope of catching up with Jake at that point, and comes across a girl whose name is Janie, and Janie is incredible. Janie is able to keep up with Roscoe on foot while Roscoe is riding the horses, and that is a really interesting component of that as well. There's another character, July and Roscoe and Gus from the story, when they meet up and Gus and July have to go off to try and deal with another part of the story, Roscoe and Janie's death is so brutal and so unexpected. And I was reading it going, okay, maybe one of them will magically be alive. But no, that did not happen. So that was the first, just real shock in this book, is that one of my favorite characters had been killed, and killed pretty early in the second part. So that was one. The other character, I have to keep switching this from side to side because this book is not small at 850 something pages. So the other character that I loved was Gus. And Gus, oh, Gus, I in the beginning wasn't sure about Gus. Gus was kind of like this old Texas Ranger who had kind of a reputation, but seemed to talk a lot and, frequented the prostitutes in town and really liked this one named Lorena, who Jake was also involved with, and just was a character in the beginning. You head out on the trail, and that's where he just really comes into his own. Lorena's timeline and story, brutal, very brutal, where she gets basically kidnapped by a character named Blue Duck and is brutalized over and over and over again. And Jake just decides he's not going to go find her and doesn't stay on the trail. And Gus is the one who tracks her down and tries to track her down and find her. And so McMurtry really showed kind of what a big deal Gus was as a ranger in that whole sequence and how he ended up killing so many people. Blue Duck tried to kill him later and it, didn't happen. Just a real amazing kind of scene as far as the cowboy goes. But then McMurtry kills him. Like, why? Why did you kill him as well? And in such a brutal way. He ends up dying in a small town in a shack with a drunk doctor who amputated one of his legs, and he wouldn't let him amputate the other one, and basically bleeds to death on the bed. I kept hoping with Gus as well that he made it to town. I thought he would survive. I thought he was like, oh, he got there. He's going to be okay. And we get to continue on with Gus. And that just didn't happen. So yeah, and some of the brutal ways like that characters died and some of the shocking ways that things happened in this book when one of the characters, there was just like a brief line at one point about the Elmira character who's July's wife who ran away. Yeah, it was a whole thing. Her character, when she died, it was just like this very short little thing in the beginning. And I was reading the book and I audibly gasped loud enough that my husband from down the hall opened the door and was like, what's wrong? Is everything okay? I'm like, it's just a character in my book. No joke. That actually happened. Poor thing. She did not make good choices either. What I really like too is how the stories and the characters started overlapping towards the end, because you ended up with Gus meeting July meeting Clara, who's Gus's old love, Lorena, who was the one that was kidnapped that Gus actually recovers, ending up with Clara, and Elmira being at Clara's. I mean, there were just so many overlapping kind of lines, but it didn't get super confusing either. And so the other part of the book that I thought was brilliant was the descriptions of like the weather and the animals and the bugs. The mosquitoes, oh my gosh, I would have been miserable. The crickets was the other one, this swarm of crickets that were 3 and 4 deep on people's clothing. That gave me the willies for sure. It was so incredibly hard to read. But the idea of just water, rain, sand, everything. It was so incredibly brutal on the trail. I thought McMurtry did a fantastic job of just writing that and making it believable and making the characters believable. So, but so much death, so much sadness, and so many of my favorite characters just gone. That was the part that I really, it was great and also incredibly difficult about this book. So, kind of in closing, like I said, worth it. 800 and something pages didn't feel like that once they got out on the trail. It is a book that, if you haven't read a Western, it doesn't feel like necessarily you're reading a Western. It's not as dark as something like Blood Meridian was, though there are dark pieces to it. It has really likable characters and relatable characters, where sometimes I think Blood Meridian has just kind of supernatural-like kind of characters in it. So very, very, very good book. I would highly recommend, like I said, doing this as a buddy read. It was so much fun, and Jack and I just had a great time reading this together. So yeah, Lonesome Dove. Who knew? Who knew this Western would get me? And I'm gonna say it's probably gonna end up in my top 10 that I've read for this year. That's how much I like this book. So Larry McMurtry's Lonesome Dove. I can't wait to read the second one. We're gonna read it, I think in November is what we said. I could be wrong, could be December. I don't know. I have to double check with Jack. So, but Lonesome Dove by Larry McMurtry. And that is all I have for you today. So please let me know in the comments down below if you've read it. Did you love it? If you have, or did you not love it, and what didn't you like about it? If you haven't read it, I, like I said, encourage you to. Would love to hear about it if you end up picking it up. But as always, like, comment, and subscribe. And until next time, everyone, thanks. Bye.